Today I'm going to go over the different genres and subgenres and types of manga and anime because it can be kind of confusing when you're trying to find a new series or if you're new to the hobby and you don't quite understand what all the different words mean. So manga and anime can be covered together even though they're not quite the same thing. So manga is a form of comic book from Japan, whereas anime is short for Japanese animation. Now, anime is often made from manga, meaning that a manga series becomes popular and a TV series gets made from it, so the manga gets turned into an anime. Sometimes the reverse is true as well, where a very popular anime is made, and it is very popular, so a manga is made from it. There are also just original anime and manga, meaning they are written and directed and they are all on their own. But a tremendous amount of anime is made from manga. That being said, it is very rare that the entire manga series is made into an anime feature. This is simply because anime is very expensive to make. So often what you see the first major story arc or maybe a few minor story arcs put together for the anime, and that is to kind of help drive manga sales. So you have the anime, it's popular, it helps drive manga sales, but it also helps merchandising sales. So there is a lot of overlap between the two, especially in terms of type and genre. So just how comic books and TV shows aren't always the same here, there is a lot of overlap, and it's because of a lot of that overlap that we can look at these very basic demographic genre and types. So the first part of the equation is going to be who is the target audience? What is the demographic? So this is going to be the first term that often gets referenced. Now, this is going to be based off who the target audience is in Japan. However, we do experience that differently in the United States. That just makes sense. We have different cultures, we have different forms of media, we have different sales strategies, different corporations in ownership. So it's similar, but not exactly the same. Now there are some very major categories that we're going to go over, and a few fringe ones as well. So the major demographics. Now, just a quick explanation, my Japanese is terrible. It's not very good. I understand this, so I'm sorry. My pronunciations are going to be terrible. It's just how I've heard them referenced by other people. It's how I interpret the Japanese, how I've heard other people reference it, so that's what I go with. There are also variations on these spellings as well. So the most popular one is shonen. Shonen is the one that most people are going to have experience with. It is the most popular. It is aimed for the young male, the boy audience. The next one will be a shoujo, which is aimed at the girl audience, the young female. It tends to focus more on idealized relationships and idealized characters, where shonen tends to focus just kind of on what we typically think of as comics, especially in Western culture, right? A lot of comics, it's for teenage boys. It's the same for manga, except that's shonen. Seinen is the adult. Now it's referenced as the older male, but you could actually just drop the male and just be adult. And it's the adult forms of these. They are technically classified as being aimed at older teens through adult men, and they are very similar to shonen, like the grown-up version of shonen, but they can have more violence, they can have sexual situations, they can be darker and grittier. Now that's not always true, it can just be more adult, more mature. And we'll get into further descriptions of all these here in just a minute. And Josie, or Josai, older female, these are stories for adult women. They are often much more realistic and darker than shoujo, but they don't always deal with relationships. Kodomo are your children's comics and cartoons. Now, shonen, again, these are stories aimed at the younger male audience. We do tend to see characters that are easily identifiable by their ideals here. And that means that your good characters are easily identifiable as good, your bad characters are easily identifiable as bad. All these characters are very passionate about their ideals as well. Conflict is a very central plot point here, and that can be through fighting. There's a lot of them about fighting. There can also be ones about sports. There's also a lot about sports, but conflict and especially fighting tend to be a central plot point. Now, that doesn't have to always be the case. You can have romantic shonen, right? Just because it's young boys doesn't mean that, they aren't going to be interested in romantic stories or slice of life stories. It's just that they're going to tend to have a little bit of those more boyish attitudes, right? So a slice of life might be around like a baseball club, right? Those are very popular ones where it is a slice of life manga or anime, but it's based around baseball, so it's around a sport, and it tends to have some of that conflict introduced through the sport aspect. You can have romantic stories, right? Heroes fall in love with other heroes or with the person they're rescuing, so you can have those stories as well. Just because it's like everything else in life, people like a variety of things. A similarity that shonen has with a lot of comics and just literature in general for our age range in the Western world around this as well is that there tends to be very little permadeath, meaning that in ongoing stories there is death, but it's very, very rare, and introduced characters rarely die. They might die but then be brought back later on. An example of this in Western culture that are very prevalent would be Marvel with like Uncle Ben and Spider-Man. He had to die, right, in order to push the story forward, to push the plot forward, to get the character development of Peter Parker centralized. Uncle Ben dies. It's one of the few rare permadeaths, whereas that character is dead and never coming back. Another example of this would be Bucky Barnes, who died in order to develop Steve Rogers as Captain America further, but then came back later. We see a lot of that lack of permadeath, meaning that character is revived somehow later, or you think they're dead for an episode or two, or a book or two, or a chapter or two, but then they're alive again. So we do see that here as well. Now, just because these are the younger male audience doesn't mean that they're not popular with everyone. Shonen are also popular with young girls, popular with adult men, adult women. It is the most popular genre or demographic by far. So some examples of this would be Bleach, Dragon Ball, Naruto, My Hero Academia. There's a whole bunch of them. If you're wanting some like sports examples, Slam Dunk, Ace of the Diamond, there's a lot of examples of shonen. It's the most popular. Seinen is the older version of this, right? Targeting the older audience. Again, I said it's the older male, but you can reference that with just adult here. Again, it is popular with adult women as well. You do see stories that tend to be darker, grittier, have more violence, have sexual situations, etc. Things that are typically associated with the, older male audience. But you can also have things here that make it a more adult just because there's more adult situations. There's more mature situations. There might be more adult humor. There might be things that a teenager wouldn't necessarily know or understand dealing with an adult might. So taxes, working, things like that, which can also fall into this adult realm. Now, some of the examples I have, Berserk, Ghost in the Shell, Hellsing, those are definitely the darker, grittier, more violent, more sexual aspects as well, but those are just really good series to check out. Shoujo is like shonen, but for younger women. So these are stories for girls who have not yet reached adulthood. While these stories can have fighting, and in fact, the magical girl genre is incredibly popular and very, very important, we do see that fighting tends to play, at best 50%, if not second fiddle to the relationship building aspects of the story. So that is very, very important for these, is you do see a lot of character development, a lot of relationship development. Now, there are action adventure stories here as well that don't necessarily tend to deal with relationships, but that is a driving feature behind most of these stories. Now, how in shonen we had these simplified ideals, right? They're high ideals. You're good or you're bad. You have these ideals and you're passionate about them. Here you see relationships and characters that are simplified into idealized versions. Now, within shoujo, you do tend to have female lead characters. Now, I should point out that you can have male lead characters in shoujo, and in shonen, you can easily have male or female lead characters there as well, but you do tend to see more male-led in shonen and more female-led in shoujo. That just makes sense given the demographic, but it also makes sense that there is crossover, right? That you would have female shonen and you would have male shoujo. So some examples of stories here that might be interesting to check out or that you might have heard of would be like Sailor Moon, which is one of the most important stories, that a lot of young people come into. Fruits Basket is another good one that I've learned to enjoy more older in life than I definitely did when I was younger. So Josai, these are going to be stories for adult women, whereas with shonen in into Seinen, we saw that it's kind of like one leads into the other. With Josiah, there's actually does tend to be kind of an age jump, so these don't necessarily pick up right after each other. Josiah is actually meant for women that tend to be post-college, mid to late 20s, early 30s. Now, they can be picked up in college, but a lot of times it's not immediately after the shoujo ends that Josiah picks up. Now, these stories are again tend to be based on relationships, but they've gone from being idealized to much more realistic and sometimes even the extremities of life. So you can have some very dark stories here. You can have stories that deal with very adult themes like infidelity, drug addiction, domestic abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse. You can have sexual assault. It's dealing with that. It's how the characters develop and how the relationships deal with those sort of scenarios. That being said, not all of them, in fact, not even a lot of them deal with those darker, more extreme realities, but they do exist. That being said, again, these are not idealized like they were for the younger girls. These are much more realistic, much more lifelike. So, people have their flaws. People deal with those flaws. You can find action adventure here as well. What I really like is the slice of life variation that comes in here, because again, these are more realistic approaches with slice of life. So it's kind of interesting. It's a different form of escapism than what I was used to, so I've really learned to enjoy it. Some examples here would be Princess Jellyfish. It's probably the most popular, and if it's not, then Yuri on Ice might be out of this list. But Bunny Drop, Nana, right? So these do tend to be much more adult-based, but still, still accessible. Kodomo, I don't really know much about. I didn't get into manga and anime until I was a teen at the earliest. So I didn't partake in this, and I don't have children, so honestly, I don't have any experience with this. So I figure if you want to learn more about Kodomo, uh, find reference with someone that actually has experience with it. So some other types that I do want to just approach, and again, sorry for the butchered pronunciation. I'm not even really going to try the last two. Um, but hentai, which would be, right, these are some of your fringe. So hentai would be pornographic, and ecchi is your kind of your risque, your almost hentai. But we should talk about hentai because that is the tentacle monster in the room. It is what scares a lot of people off from manga and anime, which is unfortunate because that's it's so different. Um, Hentai in itself is actually not even a Japanese genre. In Japanese, hentai just means pervert. It's the name that Westerners have given to pornographic anime and manga. We call it hentai. Now, here's the thing with that. It's not like it's just mixed in with the book selection at like Barnes and Noble or something. It's not like, oh, hentai is just magically mixed in with everything. It's very separate. It's very easy to avoid hentai. It's incredibly easy to avoid hentai. It's also not like you're just going to turn on like Funimation or Crunchyroll and there's hentai everywhere. No, that's not how that works. It's pornographic material, therefore it's within porno. It's within the pornographic purview. It's not within the normal comic book or anime realms. They are not together. They're split. So you can easily avoid it. Obviously, don't let children read hentai. Don't let them watch hentai. I would suggest maybe you don't read it on a bus or watch it on an airplane or something. That being said, hentai can be incredibly disgusting, but if you've ever, even approached anything that's close to like Western pornography, there's some really gross stuff there too. And honestly, neither one of them are better or worse than the other. They're just things that exist. So I don't know. It's not worse than anything. Um, yeah, I don't know. Live and let live. I guess it's not my thing, but if it's your thing, I'm not judging you. Just don't let your kids read it, or maybe don't read it on the bus. Besides that, it's super easy to avoid, so don't let it, scare you off from getting involved in the hobby. The other one would be ecchi, which is not hentai. It's very, very risque, but not porno. Imagine this as like what we call like our high school or college comedies. So things like your American Pies, your um, super bad. I'm showing my age here by listing off these ones from that age. Your even like your Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, right? Like they can cross that line on occasion, but a lot of times they just go right up to that line. Again, don't let children around it because it is risque. So don't let children read it or watch it. Uh, and again, use some tact if you're going to read or watch it in public. Like maybe don't make it to where that 12-year-old can read over your shoulder. But again, it's a free country. Live and let live. Whatever. It's there. It exists. But honestly, everything. I mean, things that are made every summer in the Western world are no worse. And we release it as a blockbuster film, sort of thing. So those are your demographics. Those are very, very important. So what about genres? Well, pretty much any genre or subgenre type that you can think of from any other existing literature can exist here. That's just how it goes. What can get confusing is you need to know the type, so you need to combine the demographic with the genre and subgenre, and that's where it can get kind of confusing because some of those words you don't know. So again, any genre type that you can think of for a comic book or something like that, yeah, it exists for manga and anime as well. So sports, horror, fantasy, action, coming of age, science fiction, historical fiction, historical drama, comedy, mystery, thriller, anything you can think of, right? And any subgenre within that, so zombies or aliens or space opera, right? It can all exist. It has no limitations. I do want to go over some specific genres that you might not have experience with outside They do exist outside of manga and anime, but you might not have as much experience with. So I did kind of want to highlight a few of them because these are very prevalent within manga and anime. The first one would be mecha, which are your big frickin' robots. So just imagine Transformers, but they aren't sentient. There's a human pilot sort of thing. So these would be like your Evangelions, your Appleseeds, things like that. Just big friggin' robots and big friggin' robot battles and fights. Oftentimes you're actually looking at how the pilots live and interact. So Pacific Rim would be an example of like a mecha. Slice of life, stories that look at everyday life. It's a unique type of escapism where you can look at someone else's life and live vicariously through their choices and actions and where they live, things like that. It's actually kind of nice for a calming effect. Isekai are going to be similar to what we call like portal fantasy. So this is not something new, although it has really exploded in Japan and around and in Western culture recently. But this is not something new. We've had stories like this dating back since like Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court would have been isekai if that existed. Now we just call that like portal fantasy or just another type of fantasy. But this is the living in another world, the fish out of water sort of thing. A lot of times in manga and anime, what you see is someone dies and is reincarnated into another magical world, but they kept all their memories, or they got sucked into a video game and they have to live through it to get out, sort of thing. Now, the next four are kind of interesting because of how the terms work and what they actually mean, and I guess I'll explain a little more. So Yuri are lesbian-focused stories. Now, it tends to be a catch-all, an umbrella term. So Yuri and Shoujo Ai can both be called Yuri, and in fact, a lot of people will. If you do run into someone that does distinguish between Yuri and Shoujo Ai, the Yuri tends to be the more sexually focused, and Shoujo Ai is the not as sexually focused lesbian stories. Do be careful when you use this term in actual Japanese scenarios because they mean something different in Japan. They actually talk about like pedophilia rather than here. It's a genre type, so that can be a little bit confusing. That being said, Yuri is the catch-all and is the more appropriate term unless someone differentiates, and then Yuri is actually like the more sexual term. It's very weird. Same thing goes for yaoi and shonen ai. It's just the gay form, the gay male rather than the gay female form. So harem stories on the next one. Now, I don't like harem stories very much, but there are some well-written ones. There are some very well-written harem stories, and it is a popular, subgenre type or genre type even. And harem stories are stories that involve a single guy with at least 3 women who just are madly in love with him and are all okay with everyone else loving them and multiple relationships because they just love that guy so much. And it's just such a hard fantasy to fall into and believe because, I've lived life. So I just, no, it's not how people work, but okay, whatever. It's a nice fantasy for some people. It's not even normally 3 women. It's normally like 5 or 6 women. I'm just like, yeah. Anyway, sorry. I don't mean to, disregard anyone that actually likes these stories because there are some well-written stories within the harem genre. It's just not one that I particularly like. Reverse harem exists as well. And that is basically switch the male and female roles. So it's a single woman with like 5 or 6 guys that all love her and each other and live in a harem that's female-led. Again, same problems that I have with harem I have with reverse harem, but again, there are some well-written stories. The last one would be kaiju, which are your big friggin' monsters. So these are your Godzillas, your Rodan, your King Kongs. Those are kaiju, big freaking monsters. You often see kaiju and mecha together, which is kind of nice. So anyway, hope that helps.